My name is Joe Lombardo, and I am the coordinator of UNAC, the United National Antiwar Coalition. If you don't know much about us, you can check out our website, which is unacpeace.org, UNACPEACE.org. We will also be live streaming this on the UNAC page and Facebook. So if you're on Facebook and would like to share that to your own page to get more viewers, that would be great. And we are recording, the recording will be on the UNAC YouTube page, and everybody's welcome to share that also. So we're doing the webinar today as part of the Stop AFRICOM month of activity, which has been organized by the Black Alliance for Peace. And we thought it would be an important and real topical to focus on what's going on in the Horn of Africa, which has been in the news lately, especially since the debacle and defeat of U.S. imperialism in Afghanistan. Today we also heard of a new coup that took place on the Horn of Africa, and it will be interesting to see what our panelists have to say about that also. It's a little bit of a confusing situation for some people in the anti-war movement, what's happening. My compass always says, when we start hearing propaganda on the news media in the United States on what is going on in some part of the world, you can be pretty sure the U.S. has its hand in it, and you can be pretty sure that it's on the wrong side of the struggle. I mean, it's not, doesn't mean that you don't need to look into what's going on and learn about it so that we can speak about it and support those and give solidarity where that's needed. But that's a good starting point, it seems to be. So today we have two speakers. We will also have questions and answers at the end, and the best place to put your questions would be in the question and answer comments, or whatever it's called, which is probably on the bottom of your screen, and hopefully we'll have a good chance to discuss at the end of what's going on. So our two speakers today, we have Margaret Kimberley, who's, let's see if I'll get it right, senior editor for Black Agenda Report, BAR. She's also on the coordinating committee of Black Alliance for Peace and the administrative committee of UNAC. And we also have Yolian Ogbu, I hope I got that right, Yolian, who is from the Horn of Africa PEN, Africans for Liberation and Solidarity, and she's also a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. So welcome to both of you. And we're going to start with hearing a little presentation from both of the panelists, and then we'll get into questions and discussion. So we'll start with Margaret. The mic is all yours, Margaret.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Joe. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Before I start talking, I want to show people where we are talking about. So hopefully I can share my screen successfully and show you on a map the region we are talking about. So there should be a map of the entire continent of Africa. Is that it? Is that what everybody sees? So this is, now the green portion they show does not actually, I don't think, encompass all the nations that we think of as the Horn, but it is literally a horn shaped, and that is how the region gets its name. So you have Ethiopia, Somalia, Djibouti, Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya. Then you have the Gulf of Aden, you have Yemen here. And I will now show you the countries that we are talking about. So you can see all the countries of the Horn, I hope. Yes, great. So you see Sudan, South Sudan, Uganda, Kenya, Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, and Eritrea, Red Sea, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and also the Indian Ocean here. So some of this region are not the countries which you may literally think of as being on the Horn. So I hope that was helpful. And now I will proceed. So good evening, everybody. As Joe introduced me, I'm Margaret Kimberley from UNAC and from Black Alliance for Peace. And tonight I'm dedicating my remarks to the memory of the late Glenn Ford, who was a co-founder along with me, Black Agenda Report, and he was a staunch advocate of the nation of Eritrea, a nation deserving of the respect of anyone who calls themselves an anti-imperialist. And Glenn and Black Agenda Report did a lot towards educating people about all of the African continent. So this is our annual action, BAP, declaring October the International Month of Action against the U.S. Africa Command, AFRICOM, and against imperialism on the African continent. AFRICOM is just one of 12 combatant commands which the U.S. has used to divide up the world. There is a Northern, Southern, Indo-Pacific, Cyberspace, Cyber Command, Space Command, and several more. George W. Bush announced the formation of AFRICOM in 2007, and it became operational in October 2008, in the waning months of his administration. The war on terror was said to be the impetus, but as we know, that is actually a war of terror waged by the US against other nations, and AFRICOM is no different. AFRICOM flew under the radar, so to speak, until 2017, when 3 Green Berets were killed in Niger. Right now, nearly every African country has an AFRICOM presence with bases, drone bases or military on the ground. There are 11 US bases in the countries on the Horn. And these nations are Ethiopia, Eritrea, Djibouti, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Kenya, and Uganda are all included in this region. Eritrea is the only one of those with no US military presence. And as a reminder, there are 800 US and NATO military bases all over the world. And UNAC and BAP are members of the No Foreign Bases Coalition, raising awareness and actively opposing these structures, which bring violence to so many lives and undermine the sovereignty of other nations, placing them under the dictates of the US and its allies. And I think it's important to keep in mind how the reality of these nations is so different from what we're told by the US government and by its partners in corporate media. The crisis in the Tigray region of Ethiopia is the one most recently in the news. And it's a long and somewhat complicated story. So I hope I'm trying to simplify, don't oversimplify, but we can take care of that in the Q&A, I suppose. Tigray is the northernmost area of Ethiopia, bordering Eritrea. The Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, began its latest attack on the Ethiopian government last November. And it's pretty clear the TPF are clearly favored by the US and European nations and by the human rights industrial complex such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have joined in the condemnations. Ethiopia is under sanctions, and media such as CNN have made up stories such as Ethiopian Airlines carrying weapons on its flights. So we have to ask why there's such hostility towards Ethiopia, which in the past has been an ally of the US and has acted as a proxy in the region. And it's clear that Eritrea is probably the bigger target. It's a country that's always in the crosshairs of the US and NATO because it's resolutely socialist and independent of Western influence. And Ethiopia has joined it as a target ever since they had a peace treaty between the two nations. And we said the following in a BAP statement in June of this year, quote, "The true concerns, that is of the US, their true concerns are always selfish, racist, and reflective of their objective geopolitical interests. In Ethiopia and Eritrea, their interests are to control or have undue influence over the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, a choke point critical to securing global energy, to challenge the robust presence of China, and to impose AFRICOM and the only country left in Africa that has evaded its control, Eritrea," unquote. And these are always the goals of the US. They're rarely stated as such, and there's always a case made for humanitarian intervention, and the situation in Ethiopia is no different. The Ethiopian army is defending national sovereignty, but has been accused of human rights abuses. But these claims should always be a red flag. The so-called responsibility to protect has been the rationale for intervening, intervening elsewhere. The complete destruction of the Libyan state, the attempt to destroy Syria, and many other places around the world. It's the rationale for interventions and claims of human rights violations against US targets should always be viewed with a great deal of skepticism. So it's important to know a little of the long history of the US and its involvement in Ethiopia. The TPLF were in fact the ruling party until a few years ago, and as such they have very deep connections in the US, in particular with the Democratic Party, with people like Susan Rice and Samantha Power, who were prominent in the Clinton and Obama administrations. TPLF have retained the services of Washington lobbyists, and they therefore have gained a foothold in getting its point of view printed and broadcast. It's the favored party, and it is important to remember that in any media reporting on the conflict. But I think it's most important to remember that the call to oppose intervention must be paramount in our minds. It's helpful to know the history of the region, but it's important to remember that US foreign policy goals of controlling access to resources and attempting to have governments in place which favor the US. And of course, we have to talk about Eritrea, the nation which ended its war with Ethiopia just a couple of years ago. And Ethiopia's President Ahmed, who's now condemned, actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. Eritrea fiercely protects its independence and has been punished for that with sanctions and with attempts to isolate it internationally. Eritreans are therefore privileged by the US and European nations when people request asylum. And that has resulted in people claiming to be Eritrean who aren't. Because if you're Eritrean, you are treated with greater privilege. So when you hear, a couple of years ago, it was in the news quite frequently, how many people were fleeing from Eritrea? Well, not as many as you think, because they weren't really Eritreans. And the entire region can be viewed through this lens, the lens of this effort to gain hegemony and using destabilization and proxies. As in other parts of the world, the groups labeled as terrorists have often been created by US interventions. For example, the Al-Shabaab in Somalia. There were some very deadly attacks in Kenya in recent years. But we have to be reminded that Somalia was a nation that was torn apart by civil war, aided by neighboring states at that time, Ethiopia and Kenya, who worked in league with the US. And when Somalia began to emerge as a stable nation, the US and Ethiopia acted quickly to make sure it remained weak and vulnerable. Ethiopia even invaded at America's urging and was later joined in their aggressions by Kenya and other African states allied with the US. So sometimes, as I mentioned, as I touched on earlier, the players may switch places, but it's always the US pulling the strings. Another example of a country in the region which acts on behalf of the United States is Uganda. It's inextricably linked with US interest. It was Uganda's invasions of the Congo, which set off a terrible human rights disaster and resulted in the deaths of millions of people. But we don't hear about this, and this is something we have to always remember when we think about, when we get information from corporate media about a lot of African countries. The absence of any narrative about US influence just reduces Africa to this caricature of strongmen governments and backward people who can't run their own lives. And of course, the interventions are meant to keep countries from developing the way they should. That is to say, developing in the interests of their own people. And what we hear about Africa is not just that it's negative, but it's always this pro-US view. So we even had movies about Somalia, Somalia Pirates or Pirates of Somalia. I can't remember it, you know, and Tom Hanks was kidnapped by evil Somalians or something. But the pirates, the real pirates, were European countries who were stealing fish from Somalia. It happens in other countries in Africa also. And, but all we were told were there were these terrible terroristic pirates. And there was a movie, what was it, Black Hawk Down, when the US first sent troops into Somalia. It's not the sort of thing I see, but my understanding is it was just about some good American GIs and some crazy Somalians, and without any nuance or actual factual information. And that makes it difficult for people to get good information about the continent, but that's why we're here. That's why we have a UNAC. That's why we have a Black Alliance for Peace. And today, it's very funny, just as we were, as I was preparing this, there was news of a coup in Sudan. And so we very quickly came up with a statement about it. And while it's still unfolding and it's still unclear, we do know that the training of African police and military by the US and NATO allies are in counterinsurgency measures to confront the mass uprisings against repression taking place right now in Sudan using violent suppression. For decades, the US Africa Command, the EU, and Israel have all assisted in the training, financing, and arming of the militias and forces within Sudan. So we call for an end to the training of African defense and security forces by imperialists and neo-colonial entities, and for the demilitarization of the African continent. Black Alliance for Peace and US Out of Africa Network express solidarity with the over 1 million Sudanese people who have taken to the streets in cities and towns across Sudan to resist the military coup that took place the morning of October 25th. Trade unions and people's movements have called for international solidarity, strikes, and mass protests in response to the coup. The coup takes place as Sudan was nearing a transition to civilian rule from the joint military and civilian government that was installed following the deposing of President Omar al-Bashir. The US did not directly come out in support of the military government, but it's not clear what that means. The silence could be an effort to manipulate the situation, as in Tigray. So we must always be in opposition to these coups. They can be difficult to figure out if you're not very knowledgeable about a particular situation. But I think it's important for us to be in support of civilian governments, to be in support of people attempting to have control over their lives. And these coups are at whatever the individual issues, the unique issues to each country, there's always a history of the US and European nations or Israel training the coup makers. So that is how I'm going to end my presentation. And I know I oversimplified a lot of things, but please put your thoughts in the chat, and I'm happy to respond. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Margaret. You did what you said. You really made it clear and simple. Please use for questions the question and answer piece on the bottom rather than in the chat, because there's a lot that's going back and forth in the chat, and it will be difficult to get the questions from that. I want to remind you that we're also live streaming this on Facebook from the UNAC page on Facebook. So if you're viewing it on Facebook, please share it to your own page or to your group's page, and it will help get the webinar out further. Our next speaker, who I introduced earlier, is Yolian Ogbu, who is from the Horn of Africa, Pan-Africans for Liberation and Solidarity, and the All-African People's Revolutionary Party. So, Yolian, the mic is yours.
Thank you. And I think Margaret presented such an incredible analysis in terms of like how the media has manipulated the perceptions of the Horn, and honestly understanding that at the end of the day, we have to always be anti-intervention, anti-imperialist. I'd love to add to that. And I first kind of want to recognize, right, that the suffering and the death that continues to loom over our siblings within the Horn at this moment, and recognizing that the only answer to reducing this harm that we see is for us to gain an international analysis, to be principled Pan-Africanists and anti-imperialists. Because at the end of the day, we're not going to be idealists. We have to be dialectical materialists. So to avoid becoming consumed by this neoliberal humanitarian advocacy, or even on the other end, right, becoming leftists that romanticize revisionist history. Because at the end of the day, we must center our analysis on conditions and not particular individuals. So today I will try to attempt to face like the truth about the mess that is happening in the Horn at this moment, and just figure out how do we engage in solidarity with folks on the continent. I guess first I just want to bring up that right now the Horn is under attack just in general. As Margaret has mentioned in reference to the statement for what's happening in Sudan right now, we're seeing part 2 of what happened in 2019. And of course, the situation is going to continue to develop, but at the end of the day, we have to stand with the poor working class of Sudan in order for them to take back their country, because right now it's literally both sides of the civilian and the military government that are not serving the people in this moment. But in order for us to have this discussion, I wanted to bring up 2 primary contradictions that we see and face within Ethiopia and the region as a whole. And as I speak to this, I am referring a lot to the HOA PALS full report, which you can find on our website, hoapals.com, that really goes into depth and provides a great historical context into why Ethiopia is in the current state that it is and how that affects the region as a whole. One, we must understand that global capitalist hegemony and Western imperialism is going to maintain its stronghold of the region, has by way of some proxy actors here. And one, it's TPLF, Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, that's a fact. But then 2, it's going to always be the heads of state, Dr. Abiy Ahmed. That is said with the understanding that the state of Ethiopia itself is not a revolutionary state in and of itself, and it's dangerous for us to present it as one. We cannot do that. But so long as the functionality of this state remains the same, the said heads of state will continue to be proxy actors by default. That is the same analysis we could have with Obama versus Clinton. They're all, I mean, it's all the same because the state itself is not revolutionary. So what we know this is a fight for the right to self-determination for the peoples within the Horn, right? So people in Ethiopia, Somalia, Eritrea, and more. The second contradiction I wanted to bring up was that the ruling classes within the northern Ethiopian region, which is comprised of ethnic Tigrayans and Amharas, who have historically reaped the benefits of such concentrated power from the state, as well as state-sanctioned exploitation and subjugation of the other ethnic groups and oppressed nationalities within the southern Ethiopian regions of Oromia, Ogaden, Harar, etc. This is a fact, right? We're recognizing that this is all about raising class consciousness. This is a class struggle, and this should not cater to any arguments centered around notions of tribalism. We've noticed that a lot of folks have referenced this struggle, this crisis, what have you, as ethnic tensions or ethnic issues. It's not that. It actually links to the real victims of what's going on, and that is the poor and working class peoples of Ethiopia, whether they are Tigrayan, whether they are Amhara, Oromo, etc., especially in the rural areas. And it's a fight between them versus the elite and ruling class party leaders and regional factions who are engaged in this power structure. And we cannot be fooled by that. It is quite literally just a class struggle. And understanding that, I want to bring up another point that Margaret actually brought up, which is this criminalization of Eritrea and the Eritrean state. It has been quoted that Eritrea is an easy target for US sanctions. And I'm going to explain why Eritrea has to do with this. Quote, Eritrea has been accused of some of the worst human rights violations against civilians in this conflict, given their pariah status. So sanctioning them for their actions would not come to a high cost to Washington. This was a quote from the State Department. Recognizing that there has been a disproportionate level of criminalization towards the Eritrean Defense Forces and the Eritrean state, one in which actually, through several leaks from the UN, that there is no material substantive evidence to actually justify any of the claims made by several of these online campaigns that you see that essentially allow for the threats made by TPLF or whomever TPLF sympathizers that will allow and recognize the violence and threat to the sovereignty of Eritrea. We're talking about the independence that billions of people had fought their entire lives for the revolutionary state of Eritrea to be kept. And actually, a week ago from the New York Times, we see that the general, a Tigrayan commander, had literally said he considered the autocratic leader of Eritrea, Isaias Afwerki, who is an old foe of the Tigrayans, as his greatest threat. He said, Isaias and his army are the major spoiler in the region. If the international community is earnestly looking for a peaceful solution, a settlement will not happen without taking care of Isaias. That says a lot and assumes a lot, and it begs the question of why is Eritrea centered in this crisis within Ethiopia? Why is it such a threat for Eritrea to be an independent state? And of course, Margaret mentioned as well that AFRICOM is, that Eritrea is one of the only states that AFRICOM is not present, that US military is not present at all. So I want to circle back to why the Horn is under attack, Eritrea is under attack, and what that has to do with Ethiopia. That all goes to what the West is doing in Africa to begin with, specifically within the Horn. There has recently been this international pivoting of the focus on the Middle East and what we've seen going on in the Middle East, whether that's Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, etc. They've been ramping up AFRICOM for a reason. Why is the pivot happening now? The intervention in the Middle East, right, was primarily driven by the need to control oil resources. That is fact. This is the exact same for the Horn. This time, however, the struggle is for minerals, metals. I mean, for example, we've seen a lot of information coming about the iPhones that can be made from the Congo, the amount of things that can be made from areas within the continent. I mean, Ethiopia itself offers a vast amount of mineral resources with huge potential for investment opportunities from the West. An example of this is seen in February 2021. Biden himself passed an executive order about supply chain security being linked to national security. And he said the objective was to address this threat to the domestic supply chain by relying on critical mining from foreign adversaries. So he made it very clear he wanted to focus on what's going on in different actors in terms of the resources that they are trying to collect from Ethiopia, from Sudan, from so many neighboring countries. So that's one, I think the resources argument can be made there. The other argument is countering any influence from China in the region as well. I mean, that I think is well known that China has repeatedly opposed international involvement in Ethiopia's domestic affairs for a reason, and that support has come through this mutually beneficial cooperation rather than the zero-sum approach that has been made by the West, by the IMF, and we see that as well. So I kind of want to be able to kind of merge the two. We've seen what the West is doing and what their intentions in the Horn is. Also understanding that Ethiopia in and of itself, when we say we are against intervention, that does not necessarily mean we are supportive of the state itself, but we recognize that we must support the masses, and understanding that there are people that are suffering right now at the hands of the ruling class, the elite, and they are being given all of these resources and this power by the West. I mean, they are the puppets. So if we as anti-imperialists in the imperial core make it very clear that we identify what is the main narrative and recognize that what we do / say can easily be absorbed into the apparatus that is pushing for war and imperialism, what does that mean for us? That means the first and foremost duty of leftists in the belly of the beast is to oppose interventionism, absolutely, because we know what the function of these hypocritical calls for human rights abuses, responsibility to protect doctrine, all these things, what they actually are. We also must assess what we are in the position to actually change, because we're not in a position to do anything positive about the government in the state of Ethiopia, Eritrea, Kenya, Sudan, all of these things. And the idea that we are is part of this chauvinistic interventionist ideology that helps to justify imperialism. However, we are in the position to resist internally because we know the number one enemy of the poor and working class people in the Horn of Africa is imperialism in all its manifestations. We are not in the position to prop up progressive movements in the Horn or try to be humanitarians like certain groups right now that we see in Tigray, on the Tigray, and as an example. However, we are in a position to be anti-war and anti-imperialist, to organize in our own backyard and free the rest of the world from this country's boot on their necks, as that in turn will do the same for us. Western intervention only serves to bolster the right-wing elements within the states. And understanding the analysis that masses have always had the power, imagine what they could do. Imagine what our citizens could do on the ground and what they could actually address if we take the West's foot off of their necks. I mean, recognizing other things such as the fact that there are children living in sewers in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with numbers for names. There is a serious poverty issue happening in the capital city, in the rural areas. There are unlivable wages for domestic workers. There's lack of real unionization. There are so many problems. Revolutionary potential is already there. And there are already revolutionary organizations organizing that are being repressed by state actors, by the media, and the diaspora themselves. So what kind of revolutionary organizing is happening at the grassroots level that is being repressed by what I just said? And how do we organize with them without putting surveillance as a target on their backs? Because there have been and there are protests that have happened in the past against TPLF in Tigray by Tigrayans, because the poor and working class Tigrayans understand who is actually doing this, like who is repressing them, and that is the ruling class. But we don't see it in the media for multiple reasons. And everywhere you go, I mean, we see there's people resisting state violence. So I just kind of want to conclude by saying that we should be asking these questions and rethinking what organizing looks like. How do we divest from these romanticized idealist types of organizing? And we must challenge this dichotomy of needing to identify some clear hero and villain outside of these two main things. We are colonized and we must always oppose the colonizers. And like knowing that we can put folks in these categories, that's it. That's the clear analysis we need. I mean, the ruling class in Ethiopia, in Sudan, are out here enjoying the riches that they looted while we're out here fighting each other. We're seeing it with these online campaigns for months. Meanwhile, there are people that have been dying. For example, TPLF has literally been killing off the livestock of poor Tigrayans as a way to prove to the West that for some reason, the Ethiopian government is doing that exact same thing. So I'm just saying that at the end of the day, we have to make these connections clear and that we always have to be on the side of the poor and working class. And wherever that is, that's always against the ruling class. And so, yeah, that's my analysis.
That was great. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank
I
you
was
very
trying to
much,
find a
Yolian.
reaction to say.
I'm glad you answered the question on why is intervention now happening in the Horn. I think that's very important. And also your statement about opposing intervention. That is really our role here. And UNAC sees that also, that we oppose all US and imperialist interventions around the world, and we support the self-determination for all those countries that are the victims of that imperialism. That is our role, and we see ourselves as an anti-imperialist, anti-war movement, which is what I believe is needed in this country today. So again, let me suggest if folks would like to ask questions to put them in the chat. I think that's the best way to do it. And there are a few questions there. I will try to ask those, and then I have a couple that maybe I can add. Let's see, Sudan is lighting up today. Are they connected to the Tigray thing? In other words, is what's going on in Sudan related to the fighting going on between Ethiopia and Eritrea and Tigray? Does anybody want to answer that question?
I could quickly say something. So of course, like, we have so much, we don't really have a lot of information right now. I mean, things are still developing. There can definitely be connections made to what is happening, not only in Tigray, but what is happening in Sudan can affect folks in Ethiopia, of course. I mean, there's already conspiracy theories coming out about who is supporting what side. I think it's very clear right now that the Sudanese people, and like, of course, I'm not Sudanese, and there are plenty of Sudanese organizers that can speak to this, are frustrated with both the military side and the civilian governments, because they both haven't substantially changed the material conditions of the people there. The Sudanese Communist Party actually called out the bullshit from the jump in 2019 that nothing was going to change, and that was a fact. So I think what we're seeing right now is the manifestation of a lot of the contradictions that weren't necessarily addressed. So things could honestly radically change in the next few days. We don't know, but I think we need to be very careful of the information we digest and consume, as you all know as well.
Margaret, anything to add there, or should we go on?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Okay. Well, here's a question, but I might add to it a little bit. It is clear that there's been a greater intervention in Africa on the part of AFRICOM and US imperialism recently. And then all of a sudden the Horn has been lighting up more than we have seen in a while, and there's been a lot of US propaganda and media propaganda. It's also clear that it's a very strategic place. I mean, on one side is the Horn of Africa, and right on the other side is Yemen, where there's also the imperialist intervention going on right now, and that controls that whole area. And we saw, you know, with that boat that was stuck in the Suez Canal, how that one boat was able to stop trade for a whole part of the world, if not all of the world, when it was stuck there. And so it has some strategic importance just on that, regardless of the minerals in Africa and so forth, which I think is the key piece that is causing this intervention today. But the question was related to China. China has also been more involved in Africa during this period. And of course, that's U.S. sees that as a rival in many ways. Can either of you describe the difference, or is there a difference? And how do you see China's role in Africa compared to the U.S. role?
Well, it's very interesting. You know, China provides a different model. You know, the U.S., the IMF, and the World Bank. I mean, basically, they keep these countries poor. China, you know, every deal is not the best, but it is an opportunity. It is a difference. You have a country that is, yes, they get resources, but they also are building infrastructure. These countries are part of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is why China is under attack by the US, a rhetorical attack. And if the Biden people aren't careful, it could be an actual military conflict. China is a competitor for influence around the world, will soon surpass the US economy. And the part of imperialism is being the only game in town. So they don't want to see China have a good relationship with African countries. To have China, you know, I mean, think of the European history with Africa, of carving it up, going back to the days of the Berlin Conference in the 1880s. The US becoming then a partner of those states over the decades, extracting wealth, first extracting people, but then extracting mineral wealth, just stealing, just theft. You know, when you see what goes on, where we wouldn't have this technology we're having, that we're using right now, if it weren't for coltan in the Congo. And these conflicts driven by outside forces. So the last thing they want is for Africans to have another possibility, for them to have a different opportunity, to have a relationship with an economic power which is not purely exploiting them. So that's why there's an AFRICOM. That's why it keeps getting ramped up. That's the last thing they want any country to do, is to have another way out, to see another model, and to establish a relationship with another country. If Yolian wants to add to that.
Oh, I think you perfectly covered it. Also, I think like assessing the fact that we could be sitting here fantasizing about what China could be doing and the implications of China's dealings with these African states, or we can like also confront what the US is already doing and actually has been in the process of doing in terms of economically, politically. I mean, it's very clear what the heads of states, or what even folks within the continent, who could they turn to in terms of providing any type of leverage or support. So I think any like idealist notions of saying that China could potentially be a colonizer is like, it's just not substantiated by anything. So Margaret kind of hit the nail on the head.
Thank you. Well, we're coming up to a terrible anniversary, which is the killing of Gaddafi and the intervention of imperialism in that country and the destruction of Libya. Do you think there could be something similar happening on the Horn of Africa? Could there be an imperialist intervention in the same way? Is this something we need to worry about? And if so, what are some of the things we should be doing to get together and show some solidarity and try to expose and stop this?
Well, there's always a possibility. I mean, there's some things about the Libyan situation that were unique, but basically the US and the European NATO allies targeted Libya with the help of proxies, jihadist proxies who half the time we're told are evil terrorists, and until it comes time for them to do something, do America's bidding, and destroyed this country. One of the saddest things about Libya is that it could have been stopped by others. The UN Security Council, there was a no-fly zone resolution, and Gaddafi's forces were winning. Until then, and Russia and China very foolishly abstained instead of just, they had their veto power. They should have just vetoed it. And that helped them to destroy that nation. I hope they have learned that lesson and wouldn't do that again. But this is something we always have to be careful of, and that is why I say whenever there is a new demand to intervene somewhere, especially when it's about human rights. How did they turn public opinion against Libya? Well, they made up stories about Viagra. They were giving it to soldiers so they could rape more women. And this was repeated by the corporate media, done with the help of the International Criminal Court, by the way. So it's important for us to know that a lot of these entities like the ICC that are supposed to be on the side of humanity are not. They're actually puppets of the US and its allies. The Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, they can be equally corrupt. So some of those things could happen again, and the very least we can do is to always be, I would just say, not to believe, especially when a country is clearly being targeted and they start focusing on the country and telling you how evil they are, how terrible they are. I think red flags should go up immediately so that at the very least we speak out in solidarity with other people and impose imperialists.
Anything to add, Yolian, or should we move on?
Margaret got it.
Well, here's a comment and question from Jamal Baraka, who's the organizer of Black Alliance for Peace and also a member of the UNAC Administrative Committee. How do we explain the consistent relative silence by progressives and left forces within the US and NATO and NATO's intervention in Africa? For example, who knows or even cares about the 6 million that have died in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Any thoughts on how we explain that and how we change it?
Yeah, I think that as much as folks laud themselves as progressives, whatever that means in this context, it's everyone's kind of been victim to the human rights industrial complex, this idea that human rights for the individual, but not, as actually John Baraka has said, people-centered human rights is something that should be our focus, this revolutionary idea of human rights. I think that's honestly what has been allowed, like, for people to like constantly stay silent in terms of what's been happening, because it doesn't fit like the specific narrative that like, oh, such and such person is doing a terrible thing, so we have to have a coup. But like, there isn't a coup going on in the DRC. People are just dying as a result of like state-sanctioned violence, exploitation, labor exploitation as a result of the puppet government by the US. Like, it's business as usual. And because there isn't like a sensationalized story, we see like for maybe 2 or 3 days on social media, folks have this revelation that, oh wow, kids are being used as like labor to create iPhones. Like, that's so crazy. And then like, that's literally all that's the analysis of people. There's no recognition further than that, oh, well, why is that? Like, why are children being exploited to make our iPhones? But because it's such a personal thing for us and we have some level of personal attachment, there's no need for any type of understanding as to why that is. But it's interesting, right, that no one talks about the Congo. But now that Sudan is becoming really hot and there's a coup, we've already been seeing talks about pro-democracy this, who is pro-democracy? What does pro-democracy even mean in this context? And I think that that's a whole nother conversation that we can have. But yeah, I think the silence comes from people who are not willing to acknowledge or face the truth or even understand the truth in our complicity, I guess, incomplicitness or whatever, in terms of how we are as people in the imperial core are engaging with this kind of information.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true, but I have a couple of responses to the question. Some of these left forces aren't really left, are they? They, if you don't, I think that's, leftist 101 is to oppose these imperial interventions. And when it comes to Africa, we just have to say it, a lot of it's racism. So Africa is either an afterthought or it's thought of in this way of this terrible place with the stupid people and corrupt leaders, and without, of course, mentioning the role that the US played in this, just as an example, the 6 million people who died in the Congo. We heard about a terrible war, we heard about rape, we did not hear about Congo's resources and how they are controlled by nations and forces outside of the continent. We don't hear about any of that. So as Yolian said, if you're going to talk about kids digging coltan, well, is there any other connection made aside from talking about child soldiers and rape or anything else that just makes Africans out to be a bunch of stupid brutes and not people who are responding as best they can to these dictates from the outside? And even if you want to talk about the strong men and the corrupt leadership, well, who's helping them? Who in the world are their allies? Who make sure that the people don't have a voice in how their countries are run? Who helped expand AFRICOM and expand US influence. So I think it's racism. I think people calling themselves leftists who aren't really leftists at all, who don't have the most basic understanding. I think all of those things are responsible.
Okay, great. Well, we're coming up on the hour. I wonder if each of you would have any final thoughts that you'd like to say before we end the discussion. Yolian, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Would say that one, I think I appreciate UNAC for even providing this platform for us to be able to have some real conversations as to what part do we play, what role do we play, but also who is really at stake, who are the real victims and who are the actors here. So I think that it's been made very clear who is suffering in this conflict and who we need to be on the side of, and that's always on the side of colonized peoples. I mean, that's us. So, yeah.
Thank you. Margaret, do you have any last comments?
Yes, I just put in the chat the link to the International Month of Action Against AFRICOM. Month's almost over, but if you look at the link and if you scroll down, you can see some of the events, a few teach-ins we're having after tonight. We have Southern California AFRICOM teach-in. We have Revolutionary Socialist Union teach-in. Sorry, I'm trying to read this at the same time, but take a look at the page and you can see the events that are coming up and see how, and you don't have to stop on October 31st, by the way. We should always be trying to shut down AFRICOM, right? So you can see our press releases, you can download information. So I hope everyone takes the time to check out Black Alliance for Peace website.
Well, thank you both. I think it was a really important discussion and just the beginning. I think just as we see how quickly events are developing, there's going to be a lot more happening. And we're going to need to stick together. We're going to need to continue to struggle together. And we're going to need to do what we can to stay the hand of U.S. imperialism and AFRICOM. There's a lot of discussion about sanctions today. And I did put in the chat a report by the Sanctions Kill Coalition, which UNAC also works with. Africa is the continent with the most sanctioned countries. And there was a new report that has just come out, and many of the sanctioned countries are getting together to figure out how to get around the sanctions and oppose them. It was a very important meeting of about 18 of them that took place at the UN General Assembly meeting that was earlier this month. So I hope folks can look at that and think about that. And just let me mention one other important case that is happening, and that is the case of Alex Saab. You could look on the UNAC website, unacpeace.org. He's a Venezuelan diplomat who was on his way to Iran to try to arrange food for Venezuela, because one of the sanctions that the U.S. has imposed is trying to keep food as well as many medicine and many other things from Venezuela. And his plane stopped for refueling in Cabo Verde, which is a small island nation, several islands off the west coast of Africa. That's very much under the thumb and has been very much under the influence of the United States. They took him off the plane. There was an election just in Cabo Verde, and the person who lost was the old person whose government took him off the plane. The new leader said he would not extradite him to the United States. So the U.S. basically kidnapped him, and he's now in Miami. He's facing very, very harsh conditions in the U.S. Prison. And this is such a violation of so many international conventions and laws and policies that the U.S. is trying to say that if anybody from a sanctioned country tries to break the sanctions, they are breaking U.S. law, and the U.S. has the right to imprison them. So you can look again on the UNAC website for information on that case, and I hope you'll help out with that also. So thank you all very much. Hope to be talking again soon. And the tonight's presentation will be on the YouTube page of UNAC, and it was shared by a number of people on Facebook. So it's a number of places on Facebook that people can see it too. So thank you, Yolian and Margaret, and all the folks that logged on and viewed us. Take care. Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. And thanks everybody for joining us. Good night.
Good night.
Peace. The blurs.
Peace.